I'm Mike Smith. I work with Lenore and Californians for Safety and Justice. I'm the communications director. So mainly want to say if anyone has questions after this, feel free to ask me for any help about the report or other things. I'll also introduce each person and share real quick the order of the speakers we're going to have today. This is intentionally small. There's a session later for conference attendees that is focused on this report and issues related to it. But for people that aren't attending the conference and others, we wanted to give sort of a quick briefing of what the report is that we're releasing today with the Warren Institute. First of all, phasers to stun, that announcement, please. Just since we're recording, we're going to be videotaping this, so if people don't want to be in a picture, let them know, but mostly they'll be videotaping and photographing in the front. So the first person we'll hear from briefly is Lauren Anderson, Executive Director of Californians for Safety and Justice. She'll introduce Senator Mark Leno, who we're honored to have here today. He has to run, so he'll make remarks and then leave. And then David Guzar, a member of our leadership team of crime survivors, will speak briefly. And then the drum roll for the research author of the report, Heather Warnigan from the Warren Institute. So thank you everyone for coming, and I'll jump back up here and again to introduce each person as they go.
Great.
So,
hi, good morning everyone. How are you?
Good morning.
Thanks for coming to hear about our new report that we released today. We're really honored and excited to be here with you this morning. So I'm from an organization called Californians for Safety and Justice. Our goal is to increase public safety and reduce costs in the justice system at the same time. One of the things that we focused on in aiming to achieve that goal is reaching out directly to those who are most impacted by crime and violence in order to understand their experiences and understand how that should shape and influence public safety policy. One of the reasons our organization was formed and one of the reasons we think it's so important to hear from crime survivors is because, as many of you know, we're actually in the midst of a pretty significant shift. California criminal justice is changing. In fact, national criminal justice policy is changing. So in the context of this shift, we feel like now more than ever before, it's crucial that we pop open the hood and really understand who is impacted by crime and violence and what do survivors of crime and violence want from their justice system. Our old system, the system that we're moving away from, was based on some old assumptions about crime victims, some old assumptions about what matters the most. So we've done 2 years worth of research to uncover the truth about who's most impacted by crime and violence and what kind of public safety policies we should have. We started with the basic question, who's impacted by crime? As it turns out, a lot of that information isn't as readily available as one would think. So we did public opinion polling, reached out directly to frontline organizations working with crime survivors. What we found, pretty shocking. What we found is that the communities that are most impacted by crime and violence disproportionately turn out to be low-income communities, communities of color, young people. Those disproportionately impacted communities have the least access to services and recovery supports. So most impacted, least served communities is a key finding in what we've discovered through our research on crime victims in California. The second thing that we've uncovered is that many crime survivors actually have a pretty different perspective of what they'd like to see in their justice system than what may be understood traditionally, right? We've done research to find out what matters the most, and what continues to matter the most to crime survivors is this notion of stopping repeat cycles of crime. In fact, that matters more than traditional assumptions or traditional notions of punishment. Part of the reason for that is because what we know is the vast majority of crime actually is unreported. And of the crime that's reported, less than half of it is even prosecuted, right? So if we only focus on the punishment of those who were caught and prosecuted, we're missing a huge opportunity to really invest in trauma recovery and invest in holistic approaches to crime prevention, holistic approaches to recovery, holistic approaches to reduce the repeat cycles of crime. We've heard from crime survivors time and time again that they'd like to see more investments into mental health treatment, drug treatment, rehabilitation, community supervision, things that would transform conditions in our communities at the same time that it would stop cycles of crime. So based on that research, you have in front of you 2 reports. One was a report that we released a year ago this month which was based on a public opinion poll we did. We hired a professional firm and did a representative cohort of Californians. That report is called Crime Victims' Voices. From there, we learned a lot of the things that then informed the second report that we commissioned, and this is a report that the Berkeley School of the Warren Institute did. And we'll listen to Heather shortly to tell us a little bit about what was revealed in that second report. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we're trying to do, and why we commissioned this work and why we think it's such an important time to have this conversation. I want to hand it over now to the one and only Senator Mark Leno. We talk a lot in our work with crime survivors, especially from the most impacted communities. We talk a lot about this concept of trauma recovery and the lack of available services to recover from the traumatic experiences that lead or that occur for a person after they experience crime and violence. Without access to trauma recovery services, what we know is that many victims of violent crime in particular are at great risk of falling through the cracks later in life, right? Cycles of depression, anxiety, PTSD, even self-medication and worse. So it's incredibly important that we invest in trauma recovery services in the communities most impacted by crime and violence. Well, Senator Leno has been the champion on that issue in the legislature, and we're greatly honored to have you here today to talk a little bit about the work you've done to address trauma recovery for victims.
Thank you, Lenore, for the gracious invitation and introduction. I want to thank Californians for Safety and Justice, for your leadership and working with my office so accomplished over the past few years, and also the Warren Institute for the great work that you'll be presenting very shortly. So we talk a lot about reforming California's criminal justice system. And I think Lenore is accurate to say that this is a moment in time which is rich with opportunity and with possibility. The work that Californians for Safety and Justice and the Warren Institute are doing is transformative, because we are really transitioning from an old way of looking at criminal justice and incarceration as punishment, if not revenge, as opposed to rehabilitation and creating safer communities. And part of that is to reduce California's recidivism rate, which is about twice the national average. We're somewhere around 65%, national average closer to 32%. But it's come to my mind recently that we really should give second thought to the kinds of words we're using. Recidivism is almost a clinical name. What we're really talking about are lowering rates of re-victimization. It's all about the fact that every crime that's committed, every person that is arrested and sent to jail or to prison, has created a victim, and someone's life has been turned upside down as a result. So I'd like to talk more about re-victimization rather than recidivism rates. I got a call about 10 years ago from Dr. Alicia Bassarelli at the University of California, San Francisco, and the Trauma Recovery Center, which she leads, partnering with the Trauma Center at San Francisco General Hospital. And I was chair of the Public Safety Committee in the Assembly at the time, and she shared some history with me that when John Burton was in the Senate so many years ago, around 2001, put forward some grant money out of the general fund to be able to create a pilot project at UCSF, following a model that had been identified in Italy as being very successful in how to treat those who are victims of traumatic and violent crime. So first let me share with you our current system, which is really a fee-for-service system. And I'll use probably an extreme example, but not necessarily one that doesn't happen probably every day in California, if not every week. So a young mother is standing in her front yard holding her infant child, toddler playing at her feet, husband's working underneath the car, and in an instant, bang, a shot is fired, and her husband is suddenly dead. The State Victim Compensation Board expects that traumatized woman who, in a good situation, was not harmed herself in the crime. The children weren't harmed, but her husband is now suddenly dead. In this traumatic moment, and tragic moment, the state actually expects her to be able to assess her own emotional, mental, and physical needs and the needs of her surviving children. Once she figures out what the needs are, find the community resources to attend to those needs, have the wherewithal to seek out those needs, have the money in her pocket to pay for the services she and her children need to get through this crisis situation, collect all the receipts, and then come to the state and make your case for reimbursement. It doesn't happen. It does not happen. If she even knows about the Victim Compensation Fund. So we had some concerns about the fund itself right around the time that I got this call from Dr. Bossarelli. And I will share with you her creative approach to dealing with the same situation. And we did an audit of the board and of the compensation fund itself. And unfortunately, though not to our surprise, we found over a 4-year period, just a few years back, that the amount of funding going to victims had dropped by 50%, from around $120 million down to $60 million. That administrative costs had gone up 39%, and over a third of the fund was now being used for fewer dollars going to victims, with administrative costs eating up more and more of the fund itself. And the waiting period of time for someone to get whatever they did get was way beyond what statute allowed for. So the fund was in a failed state. And we had invested $3 million of general fund money, thanks to John Burton and the Trauma Recovery Center at UCSF, to create a model project which proved itself beyond anyone's imagination within the first few years. So it is a holistic approach, multidisciplinary approach to dealing with those who have been victimized and traumatized. And they bring you into their center, assess all of your needs, and take care of everything. And they then build the state for you. And what we found over its first few years of operation is that it kept families of those who have been victimized and traumatized, kept families better together, kept many people from becoming homeless, got victims back to work faster and more permanently, kept people from using drugs and alcohol to make their way through their trauma. Across every metric, it was a success, resounding success. They won national awards. And if that weren't good enough, per our unit of cost, their holistic approach, their comprehensive addressing of the needs of traumatized victims compared with $66 per hour to $101 per hour, the way we're doing it fee for service. So from every perspective, why are we continuing to deal with traumatized victims of crime the way that we are when we know there's such a better way to do it? So I authored any number of bills over the years that Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor. On our best year, we squeezed out $1 million to keep the TRC in San Francisco ongoing. But we had proposed doing about 5 similar trauma recovery centers throughout the state. My Republican colleague at the time, Todd Spitzer from Orange County, came to San Francisco to check out what was going on at the Trauma Recovery Center. He was so impressed that he jointly authored a bill with me because he wanted one in Orange County. And we could see that there could be benefit in the Central Valley, the North Coast, the South Coast, Central Coast. Throughout the state, this was needed. Arnold Schwarzenegger vetoed that bill, and I have to reflect on the fact that the guy who was going to blow up the boxes, right, when we showed him a better way of doing business, his veto message was, that's not how we use those dollars. So our most recent success was that I introduced a bill just last year, SB 580, which would have provided $2 million for competitive grants so that other cities could replicate that which we've done in San Francisco. Rather than move the bill through the entire legislative process, we put it into the budget and there was resounding support and agreement for it. And the board has now had its competitive grant process reviewed and instituted, and the $2 million will be distributed in San Francisco to keep our center going, to create a new one in South Los Angeles, and another one at State University in Long Beach. So we're making some progress here. And at the time that we're reviewing our sentencing schedule for possession of drugs, to get rid of mandatory minimums, and following the leadership of Eric Holder in Washington, D.C., all of these pieces can come together in a way that will benefit victims and hopefully prevent future victimization. And I think one thing that hasn't been yet mentioned is that we know statistically also that those who are victims of violence and of abuse, sexual, physical, emotional, can often become perpetrators themselves. So to the degree that we can end the cycle, keep our children, our youth, our communities safer, it will be a great investment as we move forward, as we continue to amend our criminal justice system, to invest in rehabilitation programs, which is going to be a major part of our budget debate in the coming weeks. You know, it wasn't too long ago that we couldn't even use the word rehabilitation in polite conversation in Sacramento. I'll close just by reminding you that I remember my first year, I think 2003, my then Assembly colleague Paul Koretz from Los Angeles introduced a bill that would have amended the definition of incarceration in the preamble to the California Penal Code. At the time read that incarceration was punishment, period. And Paul wanted to add the words "and rehabilitation." This was about a year and a half, 2 years before the new governor of California added the name to the title of the department. Though of course it was in the same year that he cut $90 million from rehabilitation programs, but that's another story. So Paul Koretz had to amend his bill so that the preamble to the California Penal Code defining incarceration would not read just punishment or punishment and rehabilitation, but punishment and successful preparation for reentry into the community. You couldn't politically use the word rehabilitation and find sufficient votes on the floor. So we've crossed that hurdle long ago. We're on a much better trajectory now. I think consciousness has been raised across the board, and this is a great moment in time, and your leadership is not only appreciated, it is critical. So thank you, and I'm sorry I have to run off. Okay.
So some of you know that this is taking place today, the same day we're doing around the hotel a conference called Survivor Speak about crime survivors and their needs and their perspectives. And it's called Survivor Speaks for a reason, because as you'll hear throughout the comments, that it's critical that the experiences of people who experience crime the most are driving the discussions and policy that can actually benefit communities and create safety. So we of course had to include someone in this briefing too, which we're proud to have David Guizar, who's a member of our leadership team of our statewide network of crime survivors. And again, to just put a little bit of that personal face and experience to some of the things we're talking about philosophically, we just wanted to have him speak briefly about his story and perspective.
Briefly. So yes, it's definitely a pleasure to include the story of my family and also friends. But you know, yeah, I'm a member of the Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, and the way I became a part of that was my older brother Oscar was murdered in 1983, and when that happened, it was something that set off, and it was used earlier, the ripple effect, you know, in a way where I did not know what happened. No one took the time to pull me to the side to explain to me what happened, what programs were accessible to me, and I often wondered if there was any such programs. You know, now I've wondered back then, and so in 1983, my mom was devastated. We were already, I think, in bad situations economically and things of that nature. So it definitely made my brother's murder a very difficult thing to handle. And as a 10-year-old, for me it was, typically hard. I mean, especially harder because I looked at him as a role model. I looked at him as a father figure, and not to have him in my life really created a huge gap. And again, I think that the important thing was that no one really took the time to tell me what happened. So how that looked was, I was helping some folks out. They were getting ready for quinceañera. I don't know, it was like a 15th sweet, it's kind of like a sweet 16. I was helping them decorate the car, and next thing you know, I see my brother's girlfriend, and she kind of signaled, wanting to know where my mom was. I told her she was inside the house. She went inside. Next thing you know, I'm just hearing these screams of no, and just it was not good, obviously. So I wondered what was going on. I went inside, and here's my mom in the corner, just devastated, and so I just pulled myself to the side and just figured that it was not good. At that age, I just knew that I couldn't cry. So I had to hold something inside to keep me from crying, and I lived like that for years. Today I'm fortunate to be sober for 7 years, a little bit over 7 years. But before I was able to arrive to that lifestyle, I lived a lifestyle where drugs and alcohol were a big part of my healing. So December 16th would come around. Oh, that's my brother, passing away. So time to drink, and people kind of agree with me. So here's more, and that was kind of his birthday would come around. And here's some more alcohol, what I mean? But it was ongoing. That was just, it was ongoing, but that day was just of a bigger excuse. So that went on for years. And within that, there was definitely a lot of, heartbrokenness on my part, and a lot of that ripple effect that went on in my life. Today I have my son with me, in the back, Oscar, who's a product of a single family household. In this case, I was the one that was raising him, and it wasn't easy for him. I know it wasn't, for him to see a dad who oftentimes was able to carry himself in a good way, and then in public at times, and then on the side I was not so well, because I was devastated. I did not know, still did not understand what had happened to my brother. So when I reached the point of getting to sobriety, I was homeless. I had lost the opportunity to have my son in the household, broken relationships, and I was just not well. So I sought out help, and I knew I had to take action, and through that I was able to achieve sobriety. In 2012, August 18th, after spending a little bit of time with my brother Gilbert, he went on to a wedding. I went on to do some community work, and then at that wedding that he was a part of, he was murdered, he was shot. And I think that the difference there was that I had an opportunity to have in my life now some type of positive experience, not when I was 10 years old, and I had to check myself about that and remind myself that I was not 10 years old, and that I knew better, and that I had a negative experience to build from, because the negative thoughts did cross my mind, and I had to kind of take action to be active. So I woke up, my son, let him know what had happened, and then went on and spoke to the detectives, and just took action to want services for my family. And later I found that the services don't cover the entire family, but they did cover his children. And through my participation, and this was not even when I had even joined, the leadership group, because I'm part of the, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice leadership group. So I had not even joined that, but I had already been invited because of what had happened to my brother Oscar. So a couple of weeks later is when the murder of my brother Gilbert took place. So then I had even more reason to want to participate. So in a sense, this experience of me being a part of what Mr. Leno mentioned of wanting services, and when he spoke of SB 580, and just our discussions of bringing more programs to the community, and being a part of that element of society that would otherwise not be included in these conversations, has given me an opportunity to reverse that ripple effect this time around. And there's not a great scenario. Oftentimes my mom finds herself in depression, and it's hard to motivate her, and then there's times where she does feel that opportunity to want to move forward and stuff. So it's just, but it starts with me. It really does. And so my imagination tells me that if I'm able to tap into a positive element by programs that I sought out on my own because I knew I was devastated and tired of being the way I was, then what would our society look like if these services were automatically available to our community when things like that occur? So the re-victimization, in my experience, has definitely been a bad experience. And then unfortunately, because it happened again, I had a different perspective in life to give me another opportunity. I want to highlight also a good friend of mine, Salomon Zavala, who's an attorney. And I've heard him say a couple of times that I've served as a mentor to him. And then, of course, he went on to nice schools and became an attorney and still is. And so when I was broken and devastated, this man looked at me as his mentor. And in the back of my head, I didn't really know. And I remember one day he found me in my house. He came looking for me, and I was not well. I was using drugs, and I saw the disappointment in his face, and it has stuck with me throughout these years. And to be able to reconnect with him and see that he's motivating himself to move forward with similar circumstances as mine just tells me that I can continue to be a positive ripple effect. So, thank you.
Thanks so much. So now we'll hear from Heather, and I haven't tried verbally to say the full name of the organization, so I'm going to go for it. So the Chief Justice Earl Warren Institute of Law and Social Policy at UC Berkeley School of Law. So she's the author of the report, and we're very grateful to have her be involved not just with this report, but over the last year and a half, really being an expert and source of perspective and information on a lot of the work we're doing. So thank you.
Thanks everyone, and thanks so much, David, for sharing your story. I think it's a really great segue to talk about the findings and recommendations in the report. You all have a copy of it. You'll see that really this is about elevating those voices and those perspectives and lived experiences every day. And I think much of this content in this report are not actually my words, but the words of survivors, quotes taken from focus groups and long-form interviews throughout the state. So I think that is all part of the theme of survivor-driven recommendations for what's really effective in meeting the needs of victims. So basically, we're here today to talk about the idea that violent victimization and unaddressed trauma and its reverberating social and financial consequences are inextricably linked to our public safety goals. So at the Warren Institute, we really see this report as a tool for policymakers who are searching for ways to promote safe and healthy communities. So in addition to building on the quantitative snapshot through that statewide polling data, which gave us so much to work with in terms of what we really needed to understand, this report also attempts to fill gaps in knowledge. It's pretty amazing that in 2014, we're really still facing a dearth of data around these critical topics. So what this report does is really try to piece together the emerging research that we now have available to us on trauma and understanding how many victims of violence are not getting to the front door of the services and programs intending to help them rebuild their lives, and then the consequences of that. And so critically, this report is an attempt to identify what is working in the state in order to reach the most vulnerable population of violent crime survivors. It also takes into account that not all victimization is the same. So our most vulnerable victims, those who have been exposed to multiple types of violent victimization and trauma, sexual abuse, physical abuse, violence in their communities, they are the ones most likely to manifest symptoms of psychological distress and other complications like we've been hearing about, substance abuse, job loss, difficulty caring for dependents, future juvenile and criminal justice system involvement. So it's really critical that investment in effective services that take into account these ongoing implications of repeat victimization as they interact with the realities of the barriers that victims are facing every day in their lived experiences. So that brings us to the project at hand. So just a quick note about the methodology. Why focus groups and long-form interviews? Again, really facing the challenge of the dearth of data. And when we're talking about really complex policy issues that we need to wrap our arms around, quantitative data is not going to do it alone. So what we did is really recognize that it's through victims' stories that we begin to understand the impact and effectiveness of our policy approach. So we were trying to add color and texture around some of the revelatory findings that we were beginning to understand about who victims really are. So what we did was develop a trauma-informed protocol to elicit information on these questions. What makes people vulnerable to repeat crime victimization? What is needed to avoid or interrupt these cycles of victimization? How can state agencies and advocates promote the rebuilding of lives affected by repeat victimization? And how can policies be structured to make more of an impact to assist repeat victims experiencing violence and trauma? So as Lenore mentioned, we really tried to target who are the underrepresented voices in this policy discussion thus far. And by that we mean, so who are disproportionately experiencing violence and trauma by really great amounts, but yet we lack an understanding of their perspective and why. And so that was, again, predominantly repeat victims of color from low-income communities experiencing high rates of violence in urban communities. So I'll jump right into the findings. So again, framed by an extensive literature review, which is summarized in this report, and also expanded upon in a much more in-depth literature review on the Warren Institute website that you can find. The following themes emerged as told through the lens of participants' personal stories and stories that they shared from their communities. Number one finding, that many repeat victims of violence are just simply not accessing trauma services right now. So this comports with our national stats on this, which out of the National Crime Victimization Survey, only 14% of violent crime survivors are accessing trauma recovery services. That number plummets to 4% when the individual doesn't report crime. So again, lack of consistent access to counseling and mental health support, which was simultaneously cited as the greatest need that these individuals had. And just a quick on some of the reasons why. Number one, there were a lot of barriers to accessing services that were based in the justice system. And we go into that in a lot of depth and with a lot of quotes, again, right from these conversations to shed more light around that. There was also tension around the physical location of services. So there was on the one hand a desire for geographic accessibility for services within the community, but that often came into tension with the need to feel safe and secure. And sometimes people just simply didn't feel safe offering the most geographically accessible services, which on the one hand wouldn't put so many constraints around missing work and school and childcare, but on the other hand didn't feel like a safe environment to seek that help. There was also a desire for culturally competent and age-appropriate services. There are many conversations shed light on this. For instance, younger victims sharing the idea that, well, they felt like there was stuff available to them in the community when they were a kid that they had sort of aged out of, but yet they weren't in a place where they felt comfortable to access or navigate programs and services really intended for adults. Next finding, and I think this really harkens on what David was describing, that we really found this phenomenon where many repeat victims who ultimately did utilize services access them much later and often for reasons other than their experience, their direct experience with violent victimization. So they missed a critical window for support. And this was often associated with peripheral events and often attributed to their lack of ability to cope and the concept of self-medicating that we hear about. So in the absence of timely trauma recovery services, what we kept seeing over and over again for many participants was that they turned to substances as a form of self-medicating, which then carried tremendous reverberating consequences in their lives, such as dropping out of school, losing their jobs, homelessness, and justice system involvement. Next finding, crime reporting as a barrier to accessing services for many repeat victims. So what we saw was that establishing reporting of crime as a gatekeeper to vital trauma recovery emerged in many cases, especially for the populations that we're describing, as an unrealistic and ineffective way for certain victims. So though many services in the state actually don't require the reporting of crime, although some do, even for services that don't, there was really a perception of that being a gatekeeper, whether it was or not, particularly for justice system-based or state-supported services. So some participants actually expressed a resolve not to report crime, cited for a number of reasons that felt insurmountable to them that, again, we go in depth in the report, and also comporting with our national stats on this issue. So again, the NCVS out of the Bureau of Justice Statistics, approximately 50% of our violent victimization we know is unreported, and again, that only 4% of victims who have not reported are actually receiving trauma recovery services. So we've already known, before this, that based on the limited information that's been available to us, that many victims in need are not on the radar based on lack of reporting, but what we're really shedding light on now and really need to take into our policy discussion is that, as affirmed by these findings, what the implications are of that lack of access for this large percentage of victims who we already knew were falling through the cracks. And again, just in the interest of time, I won't go into too much depth, but just note quickly, kind of under this umbrella heading about crime reporting, the perceived empathy divide and lack of trust in law enforcement as a big driver of this barrier. There were many, many descriptions throughout the focus groups and the interviews of interactions with law enforcement that felt very re-traumatizing to individuals, and then created this sort of resolve going forward that that's not where I go in situations of crisis. Feeling labeled, judged, invalidated, many instances of feeling labeled as a perpetrator, before anything about the situation even came to light, was very re-traumatizing. And that many times getting implicit or explicit messages that violence in these communities is sort of accepted as a way of life, and that's something that people needed to tolerate. Length of response time was also cited as a barrier under this heading. Fear of retaliation. And this, though, was cited throughout gender of participant, throughout crime type that people had experienced. I will say what stood out was this as a theme for victims of sexual exploitation. I will also note, and this is just sort of a sidebar in the report, and really to me emblematic of how much more work and more research we need to do a deep dive on some of these topics. Nearly every single female participant in this research, though this was not the basis of why they were there or their recruitment, it came to light that nearly every single one had been a victim of child sexual abuse, commercial sexual exploitation, had been prostituted and or raped. And really among that population, this fear, this vulnerability and fear of retaliation in accessing justice system-based services was striking. So what we really have, the takeaway there is how many individuals, how many of our most vulnerable crime victims have this feeling that they feel hindered and incapable of turning to the exact systems and services that are designed to protect them, and the lasting and complex consequences for these individuals and their communities. Next finding, participants often distinguish their relationship with other first responders, such as EMTs, victim advocates, other medical personnel, as more positive and trusting than those relationships with law enforcement. And lastly, on the findings front, that the risk of repeat victimization really grows without support and stabilization. So these collateral consequences related to poverty, lack of jobs, housing, how this reverberated then into the lives of the children or the direct victims, indirect victims, etc., that how strong that structural analysis was of all of these participants, really laying the roadmap or looking back in time and understanding the ways that their lives had taken different courses without access to sort of getting back on their feet, healing, being able to breathe again in the aftermath of these very traumatic events. So that brings us to the recommendations. So what's clear is that our current approach fails to sufficiently account for the very complex landscape of repeat victimization, and indicating that we're really missing opportunities to prevent these cycles and prevent some of the most vulnerable people and communities from experiencing crime. We've had this very loud, very persistent narrative in our policy discourse and our media discourse about recidivism and incarceration and offending, but we've really had this much more silenced, simultaneous narrative going along just as relevant to our public safety goals about repeat victimization. And so the recommendations in this report, they're not simply extrapolated from all of this research we've done and the lit review and the findings. But these recommendations in the recommendation section actually represent specific recommendations that California crime survivors, repeat victims, actually cited, actually kind of walked us through about what they felt actually had the ability to make the difference in rebuilding their lives. So number one, increasing support for a diversity of trauma recovery services, including more options in communities and at venues unaffiliated with the formal justice system. So, as clear from the multitude of responses, what works for one repeat survivor of violence may not work for another. I think that's really the point here, that especially based on the very complex logistical and emotional barriers that were described in depth, policy makers need to really invest in a diversity of options and critical points of access so that so many people aren't continuing to fall through the cracks. And that means both based in and outside of the justice system. We've done a number of projects on victims' rights and services policy in California now, and I can say, and we could go very in depth on how effective and how incredible and what a game changer it was when we did get victim services in our justice system, and how victim witness assistance programs in counties throughout the state, how having a victim compensation program has really changed lives invaluably for the better. What these findings emphasize is a different point, which is how many people are not getting to the door of those services that are effective for the small, percentages of those who are able to access them. So basically, given the implications of such a large percentage of victims of both reported and especially unreported crime, this recommendation that California invest in this diversity of options and points of access is critical. There's also tremendously effective work already being done at the state and local level, and from both system-based and non-governmental organizations, and we really need to do more to identify those practices, elevate and replicate them, and I think that's why the Trauma Recovery Center in San Francisco keeps coming up time and time again. It is an evidence-based model with tremendous, the percentages coming out of it are really astounding in terms of improved access to improved mental health, improved returning to work and school, and really, I think, really critical to this discussion, improved cooperation with the justice system and in cooperation with law enforcement and cooperation with prosecution. Also in depth in the report under this kind of key recommendation, some subheadings about building and promoting community centers as a service location perceived as safe, even within unsafe communities. Building and promoting the accessibility of trauma recovery services in schools. Again, we really recruited youth participants of violence because we know from our statistics how disproportionately they're represented. And hearing from them where and how would effective trauma recovery look like for you, and schools came up quite a bit. Also the integration of sort of alternate sources of therapy and healing, including support groups. So next, in terms of recommendations, building trust with law enforcement through training and other methods to address this perceived empathy divide. You know, many participants believe that it was really simple. You know, if we had conversations and some training, just focused on the idea of what the world, you know, looks and feels like to a trauma survivor, and how just our basic interactions with first responders can really help or hurt kind of that emotional state, was something that they really drove home as potential to make things better. To that same end, and I think this is a really key recommendation because it has to do with really multiplying something we're doing already, allow for multidisciplinary, trauma-informed first response teams. You know, it's like no one role or no one critical actor in this whole solution is necessarily going to be able to take on trauma recovery. So the idea of having a multidisciplinary team that had victim advocates, that had trauma-informed EMTs, police, all working together, was not only a way for victims to feel more comfortable with first response, but it would really capitalize on that finding where we already have a much more positive and trusting relationship with these other responders. So let's bring this in together to really move forward in a more effective way. I think, again, it's key that those multidisciplinary teams already exist in certain counties, but really in small numbers, and usually associated with certain crime types like sexual assault, and really understanding that this idea could be applied in a much broader context. And lastly, just promoting access to job support, transitional housing, other longer term supports that were necessary for stabilization in these lives. That this wasn't, we heard that this morning in the opening, this isn't just about counseling, although that's sort of a very critical and key need, that alone, you know, without some basic supports to help victims kind of get back on their feet and recover from traumatic events, is also key. So again, I would just like to close with, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions, the reminder that these are survivor-driven recommendations. You know, this isn't a complex, you know, academic study. It is taking that research, taking what has been done that we now understand about trauma, and really combining it with the lived experiences of individuals experiencing violence and trauma every day on the ground in California, and thinking about how, especially from a perspective of cost-effective prevention, we can really do better on these issues.